Today we are talking about the Korean War. The Korean War has been one of the hottest topics in the history of the international Cold War for the past decade, and the hottest in the study of modern international historical relations for more than 50 years. Why? Because 10 years ago, none of the communist archives were declassified. So although many people, mainly Americans, have studied it, they are just guessing. What did Stalin think? What did Mao Zedong think? What did Kim Il-sung think? I don't know, I just guessed. Then 10 years later, the archives kept being declassified. However, there are different interpretations, so there is a great deal of controversy. Now, Chinese scholars, American scholars and Russian scholars have different views, especially when it comes to some questions about the motives for the decision. There are two issues that prevent further development of the research. One is that many of the archives have not been declassified. For example, many of the minutes of the meetings of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in Russia have not been declassified. This makes it difficult to know how he discussed things internally when he was making decisions. All we can see now are the telegrams he sent out or the orders or instructions he gave. That's one of the difficulties. The second is that there are a large number of Chinese archives that have not been declassified, but of course there are many things that have not been declassified because there are no archives. For example, there are no records of the meetings of the enlarged secretaries and the meetings of the Politburo when China decided to send troops, and Mao Zedong did not allow the records to be kept. This is how the whole study was conducted. Because of time constraints, I thought I would just tell you a little bit about the course of the Korean War, i.e. what actually happened, from my point of view, based on the new archival documents. If we want to talk about our views on these issues, perhaps we can discuss them together if we have time. Last time I spoke about a problem when I reminded you of the Sino-Soviet Alliance Treaty, that proposal put forward by China. The one about the Changchun Road, the Lushuan Port and the Dalian Port was accepted by Stalin on the 28th of January. 2 days later, on the 30th of January, Stalin made the decision to start the Korean War. We also have to run through some of the events after the Second World War, and you will see why Stalin's thinking changed in this way. I'll start by talking briefly about the 38th parallel. When the 38th parallel was drawn, it already contained Stalin's vision of the whole Far East problem after the war. At the time when the Japanese Kwantung Army was being fought, there was a division of labor between the United States and the Soviet Union. The US fought the Pacific and Japan proper, and the Soviet Union fought the Northeast. At that time there was no clear discussion at the Boston Conference as to who would be responsible for the Japanese army on the Korean Peninsula, I think mainly because no one expected things to move so rapidly. As soon as the US dropped the atomic bomb and the Soviet Union sent 1.5 million troops into the Northeast, Japan was about to surrender. The Soviet Red Army was the first to enter North Korea at this time, and in August it was advancing towards Seoul, and on August 16, the Americans felt that they could not do that, because there would be problems if the Soviets occupied the Korean Peninsula. After drawing it, they did not think that the Soviet Union would accept it, and the idea left a lot of leeway for the Soviet Union. They later recalled that if Seoul had been given to the Soviet Union, they felt it would have been worth it. For the Soviet Red Army had already entered the Korean Peninsula, while the nearest US naval forces were still on Okinawa, some 600 nautical miles from Japan. But MacArthur, Truman, the Defense Department, no one expected that 2 days later Stalin would call back and agree to the 38th parallel. At the time, the Americans were very surprised, thinking that Stalin was out of his mind and did not even want to give him room to maneuver, but later Truman took a closer look at Stalin's telegram and understood. Stalin said, the 38th parallel is fine, no problem, but if the 38th parallel is extended to the east, it draws Japan's mainland Hokkaido north of the 38th parallel. We, the Soviet Red Army, demanded that all the territory north of the 38th parallel be occupied by us. Then Truman telegraphed him back and said, this is negotiable, but it is not my business, you get MacArthur, who is the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces in the Far East. MacArthur sounded very tough and said, if you dare to set a single soldier on Japanese soil, I will detain your representatives in the Far East Committee and take all of you hostage. In short, Stalin had no choice but to accept this as a reality. Later on, until 1948, the Soviet policy towards Korea was basically to keep North Korea under his control, and there was no attempt to penetrate into South Korea. Even when the South Korean Workers' Party was under siege by Syngman Rhee, he did not care. He thought that since the 38th parallel had been drawn, the north of the line was my sphere of influence and the south of the line was owned by the Americans, and was not willing to clash with them in this place. Until the end of 1948, the Soviet Union considered that North Korea was basically stable. South Korea was different from North Korea in that the Americans were running a democracy in South Korea and making a mess of it, with leftists and rightists bickering in the parliament, endlessly. In North Korea, there is no parliament, just one person who calls the shots. So order was soon put in order and the economy recovered. The Soviet Union felt relieved, so in December 1948 it offered to withdraw its troops. If I withdraw my troops, you have to withdraw too, asking the Americans to withdraw as well. At that time the US was still a mess in South Korea and it was not quite clear who would be in charge. The Americans hesitated, but the Soviet Union withdrew itself, and by the end of 1948 the Soviet Union had withdrawn from North Korea, leaving 500 military advisors behind. After the Soviet Union left, by the first half of 1949, the US Department of Defense was studying the Korean issue and concluded that there was no strategic military value in South Korea, and that it was unnecessary to station troops there.